Back in 1987, the government of Louisiana looked at black women dressing beautifully and decided that was a problem. Not crime, not poverty, not violence. No. Their problem was that black women were becoming too elegant, too confident, too visible. So the government passed a law forcing them to cover their hair in public. A law specifically designed to make them look less attractive, less powerful, and easier to separate from white women. What happened next completely backfired. Because instead of allowing this to be the humiliation ritual it was intended to be, these women turned the law meant to further subjugate them into fashion. And the symbol meant to shame them became a symbol of resistance. This is the story of the Tignon Law. Before we get started, I wanted to mention something important. Today's story covers a sensitive topic. The goal of this video isn't to stir up anger, assign blame, or create division. It's to understand how certain events unfolded, how they shaped the world around us, and what lessons we can take from them today. Because when we understand how things came to be, we can better understand the world we live in now, and perhaps make wiser decisions on how we move forward. So with that being said, let's dive into today's story. In the late 1700s, New Orleans was unlike almost anywhere else in America. The city was a cultural coalition. French influence, Spanish rule, African traditions, Caribbean customs, Catholic aristocracy, slavery, freedom, all existing together in one deeply unequal society. And inside that society was a growing group of people who made white authorities increasingly nervous. Free black people. Many of them were women. These women were not enslaved. Some owned businesses. Some owned property. Some inherited wealth. Some were highly educated. Some moved through elite social circles. And perhaps most controversially, many of them dressed extremely well. Now, to understand why this became such a massive issue, we need to understand something called the plaçage system. In the beginning, because New Orleans had relatively few white women in its early colonial days, wealthy white men often entered long-term relationships with black or mixed race women. These arrangements were unofficial, but still socially understood. And many of these women received homes, money, jewelry, education for their children, and financial security. Over generations, these relationships created a growing population of mixed race people. Some light-skinned enough to pass as fully white. Think, say, Haley Steinfeld. Colonial society created labels for them like mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon. Categories obsessed with measuring how much ancestry a person had. Over time, some free black women became incredibly sophisticated and fashionable. They wore expensive dresses, jewelry, decorated hairstyles, silks, feathers, accessories imported through the Atlantic trade routes. And this deeply upset white society, especially elite white women. If you think women are competitive today for male attention, you can imagine back then when who you married literally directly determined your quality of life. Now, with the way Louisiana was set up, the racial hierarchy was becoming visually confusing. Some mixed race women were light skinned enough that people could not immediately distinguish them from fully white women. And to a slave society, this was dangerous because racism relies heavily on visibility. The system only works if everyone can instantly identify who has power and who doesn't. But in New Orleans, that line was starting to blur. And so in 1786, Spanish governor Esteban Rodriguez Mairo decided he was gonna fix the problem. He introduced what became known as the Tignon Laws. Though it covered all women of African descent, both free or enslaved, the primary target appeared to be light-skinned free black women who could socially blend into elite spaces. It ordered them to wear head coverings called tignons in public. Officially, the government claimed the law was about modesty, good morals, and social order. But the reason was much uglier. The authorities believed black women had become too elegant, too luxurious, too attractive. In fact, historical records suggest the law specifically targeted their hair because their hairstyles were considered to be one of their most beautiful features. The government literally wanted to suppress their beauty. Think about how disturbing this is for a second. A government looked at a group of women and basically said, "You're attracting too much attention. You need to be humbled." And the law didn't stop at headscarves. Women of color were also forbidden from decorating their hair with jewelry, feathers, or expensive ornaments. The goal was clear. They wanted black women visually associated with servitude. But Louisiana wasn't the only place doing this. Across the Atlantic world, colonial governments were obsessed with controlling how black people dressed. And some laws went even further. In North Carolina, the infamous Negro Act of 1740 didn't just regulate style, It regulated fabric itself. Enslaved people were legally restricted to wearing rough, cheap materials like osnaburg, coarse kersey, and basic linen. No silk, no lace, and definitely no expensive cotton. The law literally controlled the texture and quality of what black people could wear. Can you imagine that level of control? The government deciding not only how you should dress, but also what your clothes should feel like against your own skin. And if an enslaved person was found wearing expensive fabric, white citizens could forcibly strip it from them. That's how terrified these societies were of black people appearing dignified, wealthy, or socially elevated. Because fashion was never just fashion, clothing was power, appearance was status, and elegance itself became political. Now, back in Louisiana, the story takes an incredible turn. The Tignon Law completely failed because the women it targeted refused to let the scarf become a symbol of shame. Instead, they transformed it into art. Drawing from African head wrapping traditions, black women in New Orleans began creating elaborate and stunning tignons. They used bright fabrics, silk, madras cloth, bold colors. They wrapped them in towering, elegant designs. And in one of the greatest acts of subtle rebellion, they started decorating the tignons with the very jewels and ribbons the Lord tried to ban from their hair. It was malicious compliance before the term even existed. The government introduced the Tignon Law to say, this woman is inferior. But the women transformed it into something that said, I'm beautiful anyway. And honestly, that may be the most powerful part of this entire story. Because oppression often tries to control identity through humiliation. The goal is usually to reduce, to erase, to diminish. But these women refused to participate in their own humiliation. They took the symbol forced upon them and redefined its meaning completely. And eventually, the style became so fashionable. White men started copying it, which is almost unbelievable. A style created through racial oppression became trendy among the very society that created the oppression in the first place. Even Josephine de Beauharnais, I hope I'm saying that name right, Napoleon's wife, reportedly embraced Creole inspired head wrapping styles. So the thing designed to mark black women as socially inferior ended up influencing European fashion. That irony is almost poetic. But this story doesn't stay in the 1700s. Because the logic behind the Tignon Law never truly disappeared. The idea that black hair is somehow unprofessional, distracting, too much, or needs to be controlled still exists today. You see it in schools banning braids, workplaces targeting locks, athletes criticized for natural hairstyles, people claiming you can't bring your natural hair to their events. Because maybe the saddest part is how deeply this kind of policing has been internalized to the point where even members of the black community sometimes enforce these standards against each other. Which is why laws like the Crown Act matter today. Because they recognize something history has shown for centuries. Hair discrimination is never just about hair. It's about power, about who is allowed to take up space, who is allowed to be seen as elegant, who is allowed to define beauty. And maybe that's why the story of the Tignon still resonates so strongly today. Because at its core, this isn't just a story about scarves. It's a story about resistance, about women taking something meant to shame them and turning it into pride. A government tried to make black women smaller. Instead, they made themselves unforgettable.
Well, I saddled up my shoe, headed out at dawn.